Trent had mentioned the partnership that University of East Anglia has been involved with various universities, and our first person is Gina Lontok from University of Santo Tomas in the Philippines, who has been collaborating with Anna and others. So Gina leads a program about empowering women and youth in the agricultural sector through sustainable livelihood practices. And will be talking to us today about exploring synergies in multi-stakeholder collaboration and leadership in skills development programs in farming communities in the Philippines. And so I'm very happy to hand over to Gina.
Hello everyone, I am Gina Lontok from the Research Center for Social Sciences and Education of the University of Santo Tomas in Manila, Philippines. My presentation is about the synergies in a multi-sectoral and interdisciplinary research project that I am involved in. So the photos on the slide are taken at the actual research site in Nueva Ecija. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the project is to explore how organic agriculture and livelihood practices promote sustainable farming system in poor rural communities. Next slide, please. The framework of the research reflects the social practice approach to literacy, which consider literacy as a social activity. These literacy practices constitute people's social networks. This serves as their learning resources through knowledge sharing and skills exchange. Next slide, please. Looking closely at how the framework operates, it is guided by the principles of sustainable livelihood approach, which is concerned with people's strengths and with ways on how they convert them into relevant livelihood outcomes, wherein there's an intricacy and balance of the relationship between the natural environment and human. Next slide, please. The research site is San Jose, Nueva Ecija, the one on the photo. As an agricultural community, the area devoted to agricultural crop of the barangay has a total of 330 hectares. This is almost 3% of the total agricultural productive area of the city. Almost 100% of the total productive croplands are covered by rice. Moreover, onions and other varieties of vegetables are considered as their secondary crops. Livestock and poultry production is another source of income among farmers in the barangay or the village. Aside from using their animals in their farm works, some of them consider a backyard raising for their family consumption only. Next slide, please. There are two groups who are involved in the study. First, a vocational training center catering to out-of-school youth. Most of them are children of farmers. These students are taking up organic agriculture production course accredited by TESDA. This includes production of organic supplements like fertilizer, concoctions, and extracts. The second group is composed of mostly women farmers who are members of 4Ps or Pantawid ng Pamilyang Pilipino program. Due to economic restrictions, they often experience social, cultural, and political exclusion. They also face prejudice and social stigma when they find opportunities to participate in social spaces, which limit their social, political, and economic participation. Next slide, please. So this project is multi-sectoral in the sense that it involves collaboration of social actors such as academic institutions and research centers like University of Santo Tomas and Don Bosco Training Center, which is our partner in Nueva Ecija. This also involves local government units such as Mayor's Office and the barangay or village. There are also government agencies such as the Department of Social Welfare and Development, Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Trade and Industry. We also need the help of business firms, NGOs, and funders. And at the center of all this is our target communities. Next slide, please. So the core phase of the project is establishment of Farmers Field School, which is a research center managed and maintained by farmers who will act as researchers, community gardening project, and cooperative. These target outputs are actually based on our discussion with the communities during our community meeting. Next slide, please. The project has 5 phases. Phase 1 involves building of infrastructure such as a farm laboratory and an information center at the barangay hall. There will also be capacity building activities targeting their leadership potentials and project management skills. Next slide, please. There will also be experimentation such as those that you see on the screen. This entails laboratory testing of soil, water, and organic concoctions. There will also be training on building resilience to disasters and climate change. Next slide, please. Lastly, for Phase 2, farming technology will be utilized. This includes creation of smart applications and other farming technologies. Researchers will create web and mobile applications for agriculture and online learning management system for our organic agriculture program and agro-entrepreneurship. Next slide, please. Phase 3 involves sustainable alternative livelihoods in organic farming using food technology. This intensifies the food security component of the project through other alternative forms of livelihood. Next slide, please. The fourth phase looks at organic agriculture as an eco-enterprise. This involves developing business plan and training on financial literacy, marketing, and commerce. Next slide, please. For the final phase of the project, which is community engagement, informational videos and brochures will be disseminated to stakeholders for the purpose of raising awareness, knowledge sharing, and influencing policymakers in decision process. There will be a stakeholders forum and seminars, and we also aim to produce policy brief to hopefully influence policy change. Next slide, please. We will also utilize the World Cafe as one of the methods of data collection, combined with other research instruments such as field notes, interviews, and documentations of conversational encounters in the field. Next slide, please. So this study hopes to contribute to a more situated methodological reconfiguration of participatory approaches through dialogues. Next slide. In this research, we also engage in CPR. In the medical field, this refers to cardiopulmonary resuscitation, which is a life-saving technique to keep blood and oxygen flowing through the body. Next slide, please. In our project, we believe that collaborative programs and research is the lifeblood of sustaining communities. So this is CPR for us, collaborative programs and research. Next slide, please. Again, this entails the involvement of the academe, NGOs, business communities, community members, and government agencies. Next slide. So the components of our partnership includes roles and responsibilities of the stakeholders, knowledge production, and accountability. These roles they share include articulating challenges, providing insights, provide diverse perspectives, and training too. This put academic researchers into a dilemma whether they take a role of a researcher or a trainer or a community worker. We academic researchers who are moving between these worlds find ourselves developing hybrid identities as hybrid academic researchers and hybrid community workers. Next slide, please. In terms of adult literacy and learning, academic researchers involved in this kind of collaborative project need to equip themselves with training in community development and project management, while community members, government agencies, and partner NGOs need livelihood training and research and documentation skills. Often issues arise such as the dichotomy between the need for capacity building or confidence building. More so, training contents in non-formal education are delivered by academic researchers whose context is coming from a formal formal education background. Next slide, please. In terms of benefits from collaboration, this provides linkages and expands networking opportunities. It also entails skills acquisition, such as community development skills for researchers and research skills for community members. This also provides access to information and data which are only available to community insiders. And this type of collaboration expands one's understanding of issues in the grassroots level. Next slide, please. The final component of this project is how knowledge is produced and valued. This entails acknowledging and valuing indigenous and local knowledge systems vis-a-vis a scientific process, and informal and non-formal training versus formal training. There is also a need for a transparent reporting in frameworks of operations and funding resources and processes. Lastly, in co-producing outputs, we ask ourselves who owns the research and who has the right of ownership. Next slide, please. Before I end my presentation, let me share with you these questions which also guide this current research. So who formulated the research problem? Who generated community issues? What mechanisms provide inclusion of community members in planning, monitoring, evaluation, and dissemination of project results? Are all stakeholders involved? How does the research accommodate multiple ways of knowing? And how is power distributed in all components of the research? Thank you, or maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much. And it sounded like a really fascinating presentation. I said I'm going to try and come back to you in a few minutes. We're going to do you and then Trent's presentation, and then come back to a question and answer for you, and then go to the second half of the panel. So I'd like now to come to Trent Brown, who's a research fellow in geography at the University of Melbourne, working on skills in India, and particularly focused today on agricultural skills ecosystems in rural North India. So if I can pass over to you.
Jaspreet already kept around 8 cows and also purchased milk from his neighbours with surplus. He'd go out on his motorcycle each day and sell the milk he'd collected to middle-class consumers in a nearby town. This dairy business gave Jaspreet enough income to provide for himself and his young family, but he hoped to expand. Enrolling in the training program he hoped would have at least 2 benefits. First, he wanted to expand his knowledge and skills in relation to animal health. He was tired of being dependent on local veterinary doctors who charged too much and did too little. He wanted to be capable of doing basic veterinary procedures himself. Second, he wanted to build a new, bigger cowshed with a design that would optimize ventilation, lighting, and hygiene and increase the number of cows he owned. For this, he'd need to get a loan, and he'd been told that with a certificate of training, he'd be able to get a loan with a 33% subsidy. Yet when I visited Jaspreet a year after he'd completed the training, he'd only been able to make minor changes and felt dissatisfied with the benefits that training had brought. 3 factors impeded him. First, since the training didn't include hands-on learning, he still didn't feel equipped to administer vaccines and medicines to animals by himself. When he asked the local veterinary doctor to show him how, they outright refused. A customer with skills is a customer lost. Second, when Jaspreet tried to get a subsidised loan to expand his business, the Dairy Development Board told him he needed a certificate of training. When he showed them the certificate he'd received after completing his 1-month dairy training, they turned it down, saying that they'd never heard of a 1-month dairy training and only accepted certificates for shorter duration courses. Third, Jaspreet faced challenges expanding his market. Jaspreet belonged to the Rabidas Sikh community, who were registered as a scheduled caste in Punjab and faced various forms of stigma and ostracisation. Jaspreet told of how one woman from the dominant Jat caste had ceased ordering milk from him when she came to know about his caste background. Sadly, this was not an uncommon story in North India, where some members of higher castes would only purchase milk from someone of their caste status or higher. While Jaspreet emphasized the value of doing the training program, particularly in enhancing his personal sense of confidence in his skills as a dairy farmer, there were few ways in which he was able to profitably utilize the skills or the certification that he gained. The Government of India has invested a great deal in vocational training as part of its Skill India initiative and set itself ambitious targets for the provisioning of training over the coming 5 years. But cases like Jaspreet's seem to highlight that simply providing vocational training is unlikely to have a great impact if people lack opportunities to continually develop their skills or put their skills to meaningful use. Features of the social and institutional environment, in Jaspreet's case, weak systems of qualification recognition, poor relationships between trainees and local service providers, and discrimination from consumers, actively discouraged people from developing and utilising advanced agricultural skills. This observation has brought me to a concept that's lingered at the margins of research and policy making for the past 20 years, and that's the concept of skill ecosystems. The concept of skill ecosystems was first developed by Feingold in the late 90s. The concept tried to move beyond debates over whether policy emphasis should be on increasing the supply of skills or matching skills to market demand, to instead ask, how does the social and institutional environment encourage or discourage the development and utilisation of skills? The concept's been drawn on for analytical purposes, but has also been drawn on by policymakers and in projects designed to improve the outcomes of skill development schemes, especially in Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. Skill ecosystems research and projects have identified how contextual factors such as industrial relations policies, unions, job recruitment agencies, and workplace culture either support or discourage people applying their skills in the workplace or taking up opportunities for ongoing skill development. Now, I'd like to argue that this concept has a great deal of potential to assist with skill development efforts currently taking place across the global south, and particularly in India. What's come to be known as the Skill India initiative, India's effort to massively expand its vocational education sector and skilled workforce, started off with plans to increase the supply of skilled labour, with the lofty goal of training some 400 million workers by 2022. The problem with this wasn't just that it wasn't realistic, but also that there weren't sufficient jobs available to absorb this skilled workforce, and reports emerged of large numbers of those who'd received training under Skill India ending up unemployed. This has led the government to adopt a more demand-driven approach, where the number and design of training programs is to match industry demand for skilled labour. Now, while that's probably more sensible, it still has its problems, particularly when research suggests that many Indian employers often have a preference for workers without formal qualifications, whom they can train on the job and only pay wages commensurate with unskilled labour. Skill ecosystem concept may have value in exploring how the social and institutional environment does not provide positive opportunities and incentives for utilising skilled labour and what might be done to change this. But when we think through the situation faced by the majority of Indian workers, it becomes apparent that the skill ecosystem concept, as it's been developed in the global north, would need to be extended to have analytical and practical value. Most Indians are employed in the informal sector, and more than half depend in some way on agriculture. Most of those employed by others are in unregulated, small-scale, often family-based enterprises, and especially in the agricultural sector, large numbers are self-employed. These economies are marked by substantial inequalities on the basis of class, gender, caste, religion, and locality. Moreover, because of the family and community-based nature of most production, local cultural factors have a strong influence on opportunities to develop and utilise skills. Where the skill ecosystem concept, as deployed in the global north, has mostly focused on the institutional factors that shape employer preferences for high or low-level skills, in a country like India, greater emphasis needs to be placed on the economic and cultural context that shapes the utilisation and development of skills in the context of self-employment and family enterprises, and then also to the multiple inequalities that structure who gets to develop skills and who reaps the benefits. The training programs that I've been looking at were introduced by the Agricultural Skills Council of India, or OSCE, a body set up in 2013 to oversee the introduction of new standardised agricultural training programs as part of the broader Skill India agenda. Most of the programs introduced under OSCE have been modular trainings, with a focus on one particular activity within the agricultural sector. They range from agri-crop production and animal husbandry through to allied activities like beekeeping, and then agricultural services like extension provider or tractor operator. They've been implemented mostly by agencies of agricultural extension, but also by some private providers and NGOs. They last for around 4 to 6 weeks depending on the topic and lead to what should be nationally recognised certificates, though, as Jaspreet's case showed, the certificates are perhaps not as widely recognised as they should be. In Punjab, most training programs are oriented towards higher value agri-products that align with the state's agenda to diversify its farming system away from the dominant monocultures of wheat, rice, and cotton. Those that I was able to focus on were in dairy production, organic farming, beekeeping, and mushroom cultivation. My methodology consisted primarily of interviews. I interviewed trainees enrolled in these trainings both during the training programs and then 1 year after to see what they'd been able to do with the skills they'd acquired. I interviewed 29 in Punjab in the first round and 21 in the second round. These trainees were all male. There were no female trainees enrolled in any of the OSCE programs that I observed in Punjab, and their caste backgrounds and the size of their land holdings varied considerably. What I found was that a year after course completion, outcomes were a little disappointing. Of those who had come to the training with no or very limited prior experience in the field they were studying, a majority had not made a start a year after training. Of the 12 who did have prior experience, 3 were no longer involved in the field which they'd undertaken training, and in all cases these were young people who had found more remunerative job or study opportunities outside of agriculture. 6 were still involved, but had only made modest changes to their practice, and 3 had significantly upscaled or made significant changes. When discussing the reasons for these outcomes with trainees, it was apparent that the social and institutional environment did in various ways determine whether it was possible for them to use what they had learnt or not. And this social environment impinged on trainees differently as a function of their class or caste background. So first, there were a number of ways in which the market environment tended to constrain trainees' opportunities to start a new venture or make changes to practices based on what they'd learnt. These included a lack of available land, livestock, or other key assets at affordable rates, seasonal changes in supply and demand, for example, when sudden increases in supply disincentivized increasing production, agribusiness dominating supply chains in ways that prevented them from gaining what they considered to be a remunerative return on investment, and consumer discrimination, as we saw in Jaspreet's case. Moreover, key institutions that were supposed to be enabling for farmers often failed them, making it impossible to start or to transition to working at the scale they'd hoped for. This included the training providers themselves, which tended to pick winners, offering ongoing support to those who they considered were more likely to succeed and who could hence be showcased as signs that their training programs had positive impacts. It also included rural services like the veterinary doctors who Jaspreet had such difficulties with, government departments, and I think most importantly, banks. Now, I would like to zoom in on banks because I think it's particularly illustrative of how features of a skill ecosystem can both constrain skill utilization and reproduce inequalities. So there were 2 young men whom I interviewed, both from lower castes, whose families did not have significant amounts of land, who were earnestly wanted to make a start in mushroom cultivation and beekeeping respectively. Neither were able to make a start at all, however, because they couldn't get a subsidised loan, and that was a very common problem. Trainees had been told by the training provider that they would get access to subsidised loans if they had a certificate of training, but when they approached the bank, the certificate just wasn't recognised. One of the trainees took us to the local bank branch where he'd applied for a loan, and we were able to talk with bank managers there. We also later spoke to a few other people in charge of rural loans in this district. This gave us some idea of how banks feature within the skill ecosystem in the region. It became clear that first, while they occasionally recognise training certificates as part of their criteria for loan approvals, the OSCE certificate they'd never heard of, and this was despite the fact that it was supposedly the only agricultural TVET program that was integrated into the National Skills Qualification Framework. Secondly, training was only one relatively minor consideration when issuing loans. More important was having a business plan, which trainees weren't trained to develop, and having some kind of collateral, usually land, to offer in case they defaulted on loans. Third, as part of their assessment process, they make use of their local networks to do a background check on applicants, including interviewing their neighbours to assess whether they're likely to make regular repayments. Now, they might ask the neighbours things about whether they're respected members of their communities or whether they have a history of alcoholism, for example. It's hard to imagine that when engaging with neighbours, prejudice would not come into the picture. Stereotypes around low-caste people being ill-suited for running their own business would almost certainly come in. Trainees expressed frustration, disillusionment, even despair at the outcomes of their interactions with banks, which made them feel that their investments in skill development had gone to waste. Now, it was noteworthy that only one of the trainees had a more positive experience in obtaining finance. This was a large farmer, whom we'll call Manvir, who was a member of a dominant caste and a politically well-connected family. He'd undertaken training in beekeeping, and he told us that when he went out to acquire boxes to start his venture, he'd just put it on his Kisan card, a low-interest credit card supposedly available to all farmers, but which none of the others had been able to access. He also had no problem in getting a government subsidy from the horticulture department for this purpose. All it took was a small bribe. Interestingly, where small farmers and members of less privileged castes expressed significant despair at the prospect of having to pay a bribe, Manvir laughed it off, telling us that it was normal, not something worth getting upset over. The ability to pay a bribe is certainly one way in which one's class position might allow better access to the enabling features of a skill ecosystem. But Manvir's case also speaks to the importance of what Bourdieu calls the habitus, the learnt, more or less unconscious set of aptitudes, outlooks, and dispositions that one acquires by growing up in a certain social environment. Manvir knew how to handle himself when entering a government department, who to approach, what to ask, the subtle processes involved in paying a bribe. And he knew not to get upset about it. He has the emotional resilience to work with a corrupt system, not only because the system tends to work for people like him, but also because he's accustomed to it. It just feels normal. The irony of the whole situation was that as a large farmer, he was far less likely to actually utilize the practical skills that he gained in the training program than the small farmers, who couldn't obtain finance to get started. His plan was to rely on his labourers to do most of the daily work in beekeeping. Now, while I don't have time to go into this in great depth today, I would like to flag that there were aspects of the local social environment that could also be enabling or constraining factors in the skill ecosystem. Most research participants in Punjab noted a cultural tendency to treat innovation with ridicule, to mock someone for starting a new venture and list all of the reasons why it wouldn't work out. This could include family or friends, but could even extend to the wider community. Several participants spoke of elders in the village sitting around in common spaces, gossiping about them for trying their hand at something new, and that could be incredibly discouraging. Also constraining was the high level of commercialization in Punjab farming, relative to other states in India, in which neighbours would tend to see each other as competitors rather than collaborators. For this reason, a skilled person in the village would be unlikely to teach what they knew to others, and that seems like a missed opportunity for ongoing skill development. But we should also acknowledge how people resisted this and created spaces that encouraged cooperation. This was particularly true of beekeepers, who formed what could be described as subcultures within which skill development thrived. One group who I spent time with had built a small building outside of their village where they could gather and drink homemade liquor away from the prying eyes of village elders and discuss their plans for expanding their beekeeping ventures. Others in the village had opposed their involvement in beekeeping, claiming, without much substance, that it would lead to increases in people getting stung. It was important, therefore, to create an enclave based on trust, friendship, and mutual respect, where they could gather to discuss their ideas. It was also here that they planned to share the burden of moving their hives from one location to another, each taking it in turns. This made them dependent on each other for the success of their colonies, and provided an incentive for more experienced beekeepers to pass on their skills and knowledge to newcomers. So what I'm hoping might emerge from this is that a slightly extended version of the skill ecosystem concept could serve as a bridge between skill development policy and critical social science research on skills. For skills policies to be successful, we can't just be focused on how many people are being trained or whether industry is getting the skills it demands. We also need to look at what people are able to do with the skills that they've learned, and whether they have opportunities to continually develop those skills after training. And here, social context matters. For farmers and others in the informal sector in the Global South, being able to apply one's skills to improve their livelihoods depends on the support of family and community, as well as access to an ecosystem of institutions and actors. And having access to these is very much structured by one's social position. Unfortunately, skill ecosystem research to date has paid very little attention to questions of inequality, and I hope my research has at least illustrated the value of attending to inequalities of caste and class. For skill development policies to have a realistic chance of facilitating any kind of rural transformation that is inclusive and beneficial for those most in need, they'll need to engage with these complex environments to which research in the social sciences can provide a use.
Richard, would you like to ask a question?
Sure. I've already written it in the section for questions as well, but let me do it verbally. I'm very interested to know who paid for the training. There was references by Gina to NGOs, which presumably was involved in funding of it. I've had experience of a very interesting way of doing vocational training, which pays for itself by creating income from goods and services which are produced during the period of the training. And so it doesn't rely upon outsiders, because the worry about relying upon outsiders to pay for the cost of the training is that it's not necessarily sustainable. So I wonder whether anybody, either yourself or the gentleman from India, had talked about the possibility of creating any income during the period of the training, which would pay for the services of the training.
Thank you. Gina?
Yeah. In the Philippines, in the projects which I presented, the one who pays for there are two sources of funding. One is from the government because it's from the government program, and the other one is training from the university, the one which we provide. So yeah, those are the sources of funding for the projects which I presented to you. And of course, since they are coming from these different organizations, even the focus, actually they affect the focus of the training. So it's influenced by the agenda of those who are providing the funding. So if it is from the government, the agenda, of course, is different. And the one provided by the university is different as well. But yeah, those are the sources of funding for the projects which are presented.
Okay,
but my question was, does anybody produce anything during the training which can offset the costs of the training, or is it all reliant upon outside funding?
Do you mean the
during the period of the training, you're presumably growing rice. Can this rice be sold in order to offset the costs of the training, or not?
No. All the output or something which we produce for the training is for the members of the organization. So they don't go to us. So if they are, let's say, producing something, an output or products, that goes to the organization of the women farmers, not to the training providers.
Okay, thank you.
In the case of, in the Indian case, these programs are funded by the National Skills Development Council, so which itself is government funded. And the programs are basically too short duration and too theoretical for trainees to actually be producing something that they could sell during training. I don't know if this is the case that you're referring to, but I have seen evidence from South America. I think it's the Fundación Paraguaya has this self-sustaining schools model where the concept is that you learn by making money. So it's sort of, okay, learning how to grow crops, but also models of entrepreneurship to make money from those crops, and that partially finances the school itself. So
absolutely, it was a model like that I was thinking of, although I don't know the particular example in South America that you're referring to. I was thinking of one in Botswana, and there is an organization called Education Through Production, which has tried to synthesize the ideas and the experience of this, because it seems to me this is the only way to make sure that these training ideas are sustainable. You can't rely upon the government continuing to do so, or the government, as Gina said, will have its own ideas about what it wants to do, and it will get people only involved in training for the markets that it wants to support.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I have two questions from Mark Adams and from Joanna Russon. Maybe in the interest of time, I'll just sort of read them. They're both for Trent.
Okay.
Yeah. So Mark is asking about the first example, and you had Trent, and the role of professional groups as a barrier. So the veterinarians, for instance. So maybe if you could answer that one, Trent, and now I've got one from Joanna. That's a more technical one on the systems.
Yeah. So for me, it seemed like the barrier was the nature of the relationship with the veterinary doctors. So it seemed to be that particularly the scheduled caste dairy entrepreneurs that I'd interviewed didn't particularly trust the veterinary doctors. They felt they were constantly cheating them, and that there was no chance that those veterinary doctors would sort of teach them the basic skills that they might need, just to get through daily sort of procedures. But then I'd seen other examples in other states of India where there was much more positive relationship with veterinary doctors. And it particularly seemed to be when they came from the same sort of caste and class background, the same social milieu as the people themselves. So unfortunately, that seemed to be a barrier to both skill development and getting the best of those services.
Great, thanks very much. I've got a question from Joanna from Edinburgh, from Nottingham, sorry. I should know, seeing she's one of my team, to get the right institution. So Joanna's asking about the relationship between, who are the key organisations or individuals that could act as brokers in this, and particularly, Ken Spore's writing recently about ecosystems has talked about this 45-degree activity and the need to bring together the kind of horizontal and vertical elements of this. You've got these big policies that you're talking about, and then people on the ground. And so I guess in both your cases, it's who are the key institutions who are trying to bridge between these big national policies and the realities of individuals on the ground?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And at this point, I wouldn't know. I mean, the angle that I've been looking at it from is that the vocational training providers and those who are coordinating the policy, i.e. the Agricultural Skills Council, that they could play some role in bringing these actors together, that could be part of policy design. But it would be interesting to think about whether there might be other actors that you could think of as well who could serve that bridging function.
Great, thanks so much. Gina, any quick thoughts on that? So who is it, people like your university who are acting as the bridge here?
Actually, in terms of a policy change here in the Philippines, not only in terms of our location, our university, is the higher education institutions that policymakers really rely on. So our role is very important. We carry this identity, so they believe in higher education institutions. That's why the role of universities in skills training here is very important. Policymakers believe in HEIs here. So yeah, it's a key role that we are playing here.
Great, thanks very much. And because of the interest of time, because we got this split panel, I think I'd better move on to the second half. There's just a question that maybe Sally or Trent can remind me of the answer of, which is about the availability of slides. So where can people see slides?
Okay, well, I hope that since we're recording this, that we should be able to send this out to anyone who's interested. So we can share it afterwards.
Yeah. Okay, great. So thank you both so much. As always, there are, I would have loved to have talked much longer than we have time here. We have now a second half of the panel, and so I'd like to bring up next Seema Purushothaman, who's Professor of Sustainability at Premji University in India. And her research is on the interface of ecological economics and agrarian studies. Very exciting topic. And talking today about adaptive skilling amongst the Advocacy community. So great welcome to you. And please go ahead.
Thank you, Simon. I'm glad to be here, at least virtually meeting my colleagues and friends. So this presentation on adaptive skilling among Adivasis is based on a collaborative action research project that a few among the faculty of Azimbrindi University undertake with an organization called Professional Assistance for Development Action, PRADAN. Next slide, please. So this presentation I have organized in 4 sections. The first is about the study sites, without going into the details of how actually we selected the study sites or the method that we followed to form the action research team. I'm getting straight into the villages, the 3 villages that we chose in 2 states of India, and then we will unpack what transpired in these 3 villages in around 1 year's time from the beginning it had in 2018 January. And following that, the 3rd section will be on actually what is on offer in the process of development that is unfolding in these 3 villages. And the final section will be on what is briefly proposed in this action research project, which we call as adaptive skilling. Next slide, please. So quickly, we have a glimpse of these 2 states of the Central Indian Plateau, Madhya Pradesh and Jharkhand. These are heavily forested and inhabited by indigenous people called tribals in India. And first we go to the village in Singrauli district of Madhya Pradesh, which is in the next slide, the glimpses of Chatniha. Next slide, please. Chatniha has approximately 380 households, mostly of Gond community, and their landholding size is relatively large compared to the other 2 villages in the study or the action research. The history goes back actually most recent among the 3 villages, and it has been felled from its very dense forests, which were used as open prison during the kingdom of Reva. And then tribes like Gonds came down to settle. And later on, when upper caste large landholders were allotted land in the forested landscape, they moved in with their bonded labor from other parts. And hence, Chatniha has a mixed constituency of tribals, but dominated by Gonds. Gonds actually have fertile, relatively low-lying valley land to grow paddy. And the other communities have relatively steep slopes. And the entire landscape in Chatniha looks like a stony, undulating landscape, deficient in soil moisture, biomass, and water resources. You see a lot of millets being grown, and land conflicts are prevalent. And surprisingly, but not so surprisingly, also given the remoteness of the village from the nearest town, low out-migration and low engagement in non-farm jobs and precarious life altogether. So to unpack the gains in the development outcomes so far seen in these 3 villages, they are almost similar. Those are the welfare schemes in food distribution or rural employment guarantee schemes or the microcredit self-help groups among women. Now, the losses and vulnerabilities that we see, which actually got accumulated over time, these 4 or 5 decades of development action in this village has been a definite loss of dignity. Every now and then in every conversation, you will hear the word poverty, be poor, what do we do type of conversations happening in village Chatniha. And the ecological degradation is very evident. You can't believe that it used to be a thick forest around 60, 70 years ago. Malnutrition and poverty trap are also really visible. Next slide, please. So we go to the next village in Madhya Pradesh, in another district of Dindori, which is the birthplace of the mighty river Narmada. This village is relatively better off. Next slide, please. The Khugri village is occupied by 215 Gond families with also a relatively larger holding for the marginal community of tribals. And the nearest big town is not so far. And history is also a little longer, around 150 years ago. And they were the captive labor force for the forest department from the colonial times. And according to the villagers, the exploitation continued till recently, even after independence by the department. So presently, Khugri appears like a land of reasonably fertile soil, nourished by the nutrients from the forested hills, and hence farmers don't apply much inputs. and hence, there is no space for green revolution kind of agriculture being popular in the village. And the Department of Agriculture, the line agency of the state government, is trying to actually extend organic farming based on external inputs. So the packages of organic inputs of biopesticides and bioenzymes you can see lying around being extended without logic or conviction among the tribes. Now, the gains and strengths in terms of development are the same as we saw in Chatniham. The loss and vulnerabilities actually are added on by the ecological know-how, the erosion of ecological skills that I want to add to the skill ecosystem that Trent was talking about. In marginalized tribal communities, ecological skills have the mainstay in finding combination of livelihoods as a livelihood basket, which can sustain, the welfare means for the tribals. So degraded grazing areas and eroded ecological know-how are the hallmarks of the village in Kugri. And of course, it's quite conspicuous compared to Chatniha, which was very close to deprivation. Here it is conspicuous that the younger generation who are getting educated are very distant from the tribal ethos and their unique social ecological strengths. Next slide, please. This is the village Jana in Jharkhand's Gumla district. This is the most, this is the less remote of the three villages that we are undertaking the project in. And this is also inhabited by lesser number of families, but of a different community called Orawans. Next slide, please. So this has only around 87 families of Orawans, operating on smaller pieces of land of around 2.5 acres. And all the lands in actually all three villages lie in three different gradients. But in Jana, the proportion of land in the lowest gradient or valleys is high, and hence their commercial cultivation within their land holding is higher than the other two villages. So they are almost close to being seasoned farmers. But because of the 3 centuries of settlement in the landscape, they also have somewhat intact ecological institutions and ecological know-how, but they are on the way out, and that also has been leading them to closer to emulating the big landlords around the village coming from other communities. And they also have started taking loans to invest in commercial farming, and that is where we see the vulnerability being added in the nutrition and food security. Next slide, please. So in the first 12 months, what we did in these villages was a series of engagements with the village in different forms. This slide gives you the themes in sequence, how it followed. So we started asking about individuals' idea about development and good life, which led subsequently to the role of community and tribalness in their well-being, which again led to role of agriculture in that. And that particular discussion organically led to the relationship between the surrounding ecology, which includes farms, village commons, water bodies, and forests, and the changes in these, and then finally to their status of well-being, food, health, and livelihood. Next slide, please. So these set of slides now actually present what we elicited from the village discourses. The first was about a development framing. The development context that they wanted to talk about development in the backdrop of was 3 ellipses, or they didn't draw the ellipses. I mean, it's for us to put it in the format that we have given here. But they started talking about hum hamare jungle hamare khet. So these 3 being the central to any development framing, and then their livelihoods and institutions. So the mutually interactive and overlapping entities, institutions, and livelihoods were very sacrosanct for them to think about any development project. Next slide, please. So in that context of the development framing, they could actually easily project the loopholes in the current development project, which was unfolding in the villages for 3-4 decades. So it has the huge transaction cost, and that too ending up with very minor improvements, and that too very temporary and uncertain. So it looked like the development mainstreaming of tribals meant that giving them some right to small marginal land, some formal education, and eyeing at only the reserved job at the government, and some rural employment guarantee meant development in the mainstream societal sense. Next slide, please. So what was eventually traded off for this development process that unfolded was three things: de-skilling, detribalization, and individualization. So de-skilling was a breakage of the process by which the agroecological skills were being evolved, along with their culinary and ethno-medicinal knowledge were evolved and always nourished through time. And it could be translated into many of those things that we already saw in the context of villages. Next slide, please. So there was another example of this disjunct lack of creative enterprise going into the development intervention, and which is in terms of how food and income are being traded off from the small piece of land, depending on how food distribution is happening by the state. Next slide, please. So the development that is needed for them was something that will ensure that the basic needs are under local control, which means that agriculture first will be for sovereign food security for them. And if these two cannot be met in the local context, PDS and the welfare scheme have a definitive role. And the small surpluses to be extended to the local demand needed external facilitation, and altogether this needed rejuvenation of ecological skilling. And that meant adapting to current realities of ecological changes, economic changes, and political dynamics. This means tribals need to know their uniqueness, the social ecological strengths, their constitutional rights. The by now famous Forest Rights Act in 2006 is not implemented, not even familiar to the people in these three villages. Distributional normatives, which are kind of new to them in the lack of traditional institutions and absence of new institutions emerging in their place, and the essentiality of the link between commons and forest and village. So what is an offer that we actually saw, where the welfare schemes and the skill development programs that Trent has already dwelt upon. And so we move to the next slide, which explains what is being proposed in this action research. This is what we call as adaptive skilling for Adivasi farmers. It is a continuous context-specific and informed integration of in situ and ex situ skills and know-how for reliable, equitable, and sustainable agricultural value chains, not high-income, commercial, export-oriented value chains that can balance nutritional autonomy and farm incomes. So adaptive skilling among Adivasi farmers aims at adaptive changes in the interface of people farming and rural commons towards moving the village towards a resilient social ecological system that minimizes sudden and extreme shifts in agroecology, livelihoods, and well-being. So next slide, please. So in the interest in moving towards our adaptive skilling and following the discourses and exposures during the action research project, the villages started undertaking collective action in the spirit of tribal ethos. So what you see is a reconfiguration of tribal ethos that is happening in the village. Next slide, please. And then in the interest of skilling, moving towards adaptive skilling, we also see a lot of experimentation. Here is where we could help a little bit. Some of those came from themselves, but some of it also was the ideas were given by us, but the monitoring is with the community in each village. Next slide, please. So this is the last slide, which says that the apparent conventional dilemma that we see between the mainstream development and tribal development seems to be artificial, but it is neither identical and nor mutually exclusive. What needs to be changed is to, of course, give them adaptive skilling, as we clearly said, but also in the backdrop of keeping the options open and accessible with required information to identify the pros and cons, the trade-offs in each choice that they end up making. And then the second part, or the conditionalities for facilitating adaptive skilling, will be to help evolve institutions to nurture the social ecological know-how and local self-governance in the constitutional provisions that are existing. Thus, in that case, adaptive skilling will be the journey towards a new development equilibrium among the marginalized, which is kind of discussed in Latin American context that we have heard. Thank you very much.
I would like now, if I can, to invite Kudu Mbeba, who is the founder and the executive officer of Labo Business Consultancy, working on issues of land rights and energy and enterprise in agriculture in Gauteng in Northwest in South Africa, who's going to talk about skills transfer as a critical factor in ensuring successful land reform. So if I can pass over to you, please.
Hello, my name is Kudu Mbeba from Labo Business Consulting Pty Ltd in the Republic of South Africa. I will be making a presentation regarding my topic is skills transfer is crucial in ensuring successful land reform program to beneficiaries in South Africa. And the motto that I go with is empower communities to work the land. This is my presentation outline. The first part will be the land question as it relates to what is happening currently, and we'll deal with the historical context, the reform process that started before 1994, and we'll also talk about the objectives that happened post 1994 with all the acts which were enacted in post 1994 with the land reform programs, and we'll deal briefly with the status of land reform in South Africa. The last two parts are actually the crux of this presentation. We'll do a synopsis and analysis of land reform projects, and lastly, I will deal with the recommended model for skills transfer for land beneficiaries in South Africa. The land question is a very diverse and a very emotive issue in this country, as since 1994, it has not been addressed to the satisfaction of everybody who is interested in it. There's been lots of plans on the cards, moderate, some transformational land plans, but nothing concrete has happened. Of late, for the past 2 years, we had what we call expropriation of land without compensation, which is on the cards. There's various consultations taking place in that regard, but nothing has been tabled as yet as a final document. Historical context, we had 4 pieces of legislation which were very instrumental in ensuring that the majority of Black people lose their land. In particular, the 1913 Act 27 called Natives Land Act. It was very instrumental in ensuring that most part of the land is taken away from Black people. Those 4 pieces of legislation actually ensured that land was exclusively reserved for white ownership. Basically, 87% of South Africa's land was reserved for ownership by white people, and Black people were left with about 13% and to be shared with the homelands and for all sorts of things. Obviously, 13%, it's nothing for land. Land dispossession is a structural challenge in this country where the majority of Black people do not have land. They are landless, and as you can see in those pictures, and this is as a result of lack of land. And that land dispossession ensured that 100 years of farming skills is eroded from Black people. So Black people were taken off the land, basically meaning that even their skills were taken away. The historical context in terms of rural areas, poverty is very, very rampant. It's very rife in rural areas, compounded by lack of services. That's why the government of the day, they ensured that all the land reform projects are focused in rural areas. However, rural areas in South Africa, typical, you've got inadequate levels of literacy and numeracy, and the able and the fit, usually, they migrate to urban areas, particularly the youth. Immediately after completing their schooling, they'll go to urban areas, obviously for obvious reasons, where economic opportunities and better service their delivery in those areas. Rural areas, in terms of the survey that was conducted by Stats SA in 2016, almost over 80% of South Africans, they want land mainly for two things. Over 40%, they said it's a source of household food. That's why they want land. And 37.5, they said they need access to land because it's extra source of household food. So it's imperative that these people have access to agricultural land so that they can sustain their food supply. Then came the dawn of democracy in 1994, where everybody voted. And, as we can see, the greatest man who led South Africa into democracy in 1994. Then they started the reform process, which is now in the hands of the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform, which is the custodian of this whole process in terms of its constitutional mandate. Their mandate is to ensure access to land on an equitable basis. In the history of South Africa's land, we know that most Black Africans have unequal access to land. So this department, it's their mandate to ensure that this land is equitably shared amongst everybody who stays on it. The objectives of post-1994 land reform, it has three legs. First, to provide redress for historical injustice. Secondly, is to create sustainable livelihoods, mostly through employment creation, and to ensure that there's equitable forms of growth within the socially differentiated rural and urban settings as it pertains to South Africa, which has got a high rate of unequal distribution of land in the country. Post-1994 government plan, the government enacted what they call RDP, Reconstruction and Development Program, RDP, which was just a strategy to remedy the challenges of one, poverty, inequality, joblessness, and landlessness. And the RDP was a strategy of government to ensure that most of the people, they get land so that they can deal with the issues of poverty, inequality, and those other two. Right, post-1994, these pieces of legislation were very critical in ensuring that they eroded the apartheid-based laws, which actually ensured that most of the land was taken away from Black people. Land reform programs, we had three emanating from the legislation that was passed. Firstly, we had what we called a Recapitalization and Development Program, RECAP. Secondly, they enacted what they called a Comprehensive Agricultural Support Program, CASP. The third one is a Comprehensive Rural Development Program. And these programs were all geared to ensuring that when Black people are given land, then they can be able to be supported by the government. The land reform programs, they had three components. The first one is the land restitution, where people who were forcefully removed from their land were financially compensated for that hardship. The second one is land redistribution, which is mainly to providing land to people who do not have land and wanted land for productive and residential purposes. Lastly, it was land tenure, ensuring that people who were staying on a land had formal documentation and paperwork to prove that they belong on the land that they've been occupying for quite a lot of time, for a long time. Basically, our land reform program has three legs: land restitution, land redistribution, and land tenure. What is the status of land reform in this country? In 1994, there was a target of 30% of land that had to be redistributed by 2014, which was approximately 26 million hectares. That was from the entire land that was earmarked for reform, totaled about 78 million hectares. However, in terms of what has happened, only 8 million, that was about 10.7% of land has been allocated to beneficiaries. And in the last 2 years, 2017-2018 financial year, 105 hectares was returned to beneficiaries, and only 10,800 hectares was redistributed. But also the third part is that approximately about 70% of farms taken over by black beneficiaries have been unsuccessful, which is an indictment on the process that was used to redistribute, to allocate land to land beneficiaries. And the reason for this is that there was no post-settlement support from government and other agencies like the Land Bank, private banks, and other developmental institutions. Now we're getting into the synopsis of land reform, and on the picture there is people who were complaining about the process of land reform, and people complaining that it was taking way too long. This was in Cape Town about 2 years back, when people were complaining that the land process is very slow. This is a map of South Africa. We've got 9 provinces, right? We're going to focus on the 2 at the top, bordering Zimbabwe and Botswana. It's Limpopo and Northwest. This is an analysis of select land reform projects which happened in Bilabela in the province of Limpopo. Here's Bilabela. Out of 40 projects, almost 19 of them, they attempted to use the land with no significant production, that is no benefit gained. That's about 47% of those land reform projects. And about 2 were no significant benefits gained, but land was partly used. Number 3, land was being used with some benefits gained, with about 9 farms representing about 22.5. In total, almost 60 to 70% of those farms have failed, mainly due to poor post-settlement support. Also, they had what we call communal property associations. These CPAs, there were 12 of them. Half of these were basically not operating, and some were dysfunctional. And the reason, there were lots of reasons given associated with the failure. And there's a challenge of how CPAs work, because the CPA has to be operated in a legal way. And there's also challenges in terms of poor leadership, boards and excos were dysfunctional, poor community structures. All of these contributed to these communal property associations failing in their mandate. Then we're going to get into Northwest Province. This is the Northwest Province with 4 districts. We will be focusing on Bujanala Platinum District and in the Moses Kotane area. In a longitudinal study that was conducted in 2017 by Kirsten between 2005 and 2010, production had increased in 2005 on 23 farms, but in 2010 only on 11 farms, and 11% of those farms. Production was halted in 2005 in 21% of those farms, but in 2010 that number had increased to 27%. Cooperatives in this country, if you establish a cooperative, the government will give you a startup grant of 350,000, which is about £20,000 or $16,000, which this process is done by the Department of Trade and Industry through what they call Cooperative Incentive Scheme. These cooperatives had issues. First one is literacy and numeracy, major concern. Community cohesion, problematic. Communal farming, it's not an easy thing to do. Some members, they were there just they're trying to make a quick buck. They had no interest in terms of the operational activities of a cooperative. Most of them, they were not even capacitated in terms of how to run a cooperative, which is a legal entity. Some operated with no profit motive. Lastly, others did not even have, did not even put in any effort with this entitlement mentality that they had. The evaluation of these land reform projects in 6 provinces in 2012-2013 in the Eastern Cape, Free State, Gauteng, KwaZulu-Natal, Limpopo, and Northwest. The outcome was the institutional arrangements of government had duplicated plans. resulting in wasted public funds. The best solution of that evaluation, redesign and overhaul all the support programs inland in agriculture. Also, they had to do away with silos where Department of Agriculture would do this, Land Affairs would do this. They just said, take everything out. On average, 3.5 million rand was used per project. About 520,000 rand was for each beneficiary, and the total cost for each job created was about 29,000 pounds, which is about 645,000. Unfortunately, the project was mailed dry by mentors and development partners with limited or no skills transfer at all. 1994 to 2016, the land reform program had done nothing to alter the agrarian structure of South Africa. Nothing, no impact on livelihoods in the rural areas. 69,000 urban restitution land claims have been through cash component, basically meaning people opted to get the cash but did not get the land. So it did not serve any purpose. The recommended model for skills transfer to land beneficiaries, the selection criteria is very critical. Age of the beneficiaries has to be taken into consideration because of the physical nature of agriculture and farming. Education is critical. Managerial aptitude, people should know how to manage, particularly funds. Also the financial standing of those people, they need to manage funds. Farming experience is critical. People have to check also the entrepreneurial skills. I put in gender there because of the physical requirements of farming. So that also has to be taken into consideration. There are three components that we need to be taken into consideration. The individual and communal farmers, they have to go through a farmer orientation program. There must be compulsory capacitation program. Mentorship and coaching, that's a no-brainer. That has always to be there. On the second part, there has to be a post-settlement farmer support where there's a strengthening of the agricultural extension services where you get people who will go physically to those farms. Then you must also have a dedicated sustainable development unit for those farmers. Then the institutional and financial support has to be there so that they can train people in terms of how to generate profit, deal with the funds that they get from government and all that. Then there also has to be a farmer support institute of excellence where you've got specialists, technicians, veterinarians, geologists, all those kind of people supporting these land beneficiaries, also imparting their skills to these land beneficiaries. Otherwise, it's just going to be chaos, as we have seen in the past 30 years of land reform, where basically nothing has been done in concrete to ensure that land reform happens in this country. Mostly is poor post-settlement support. None has ever happened, but money has been spent. So it's high time that this gets sorted in a different way, overhauling the whole system of land reform. This is the end of my presentation. I will entertain questions later.
Hi there. I thought that if nobody else has a question, I might ask one.
Right.
So I suppose one of the issues with this framing of de-skilling is that, of course, some skills are being lost, but maybe some other skills are being gained. So you mentioned them emulating the landlords in the village and adopting more sort of commercial approaches to farming, which also, I suppose, implies a set of skills associated with that. And of course, it might be that the skills that are lost are very important, like for their role in ecological sustainability and that kind of thing. But I'm just wondering how people themselves would experience. Would these Adivasi communities experience this as being that they've lost skills, or would they actually think that they've gained skills?
Well, the skills of mainstream farming actually have not dissipated into these tribal farmers. While they are trying to emulate the mainstream farmers, they are far, far away from it. One is that their landscape itself is at the margins of agricultural extension, so it's very rare that government research organizations or extension personnel reach the landscape. Secondly, they are not actually farmers in their orientation. Till a few decades ago, they were hunter-gatherers. And to the maximum extent, they would have been doing some mixed sowing of millets and pulses for their own use. So they haven't picked up much skills at all. If at all, there are some new seeds which are new to the landscape being sown, it is because some companies reach and just give them with some incentives so that de-skilling happen with their own value and knowledge base about their own seeds. At the same time, they don't have the correct know-how and skills attached to what kind of new seed will be appropriate for them. So what people feel is actually they feel that they're very cautious. They are not really articulate in the way we probably would interpret them. But what I see, what we observe is that there is a nowhereness. We are neither the tribal farmers, nor are we the mainstream farmers. I mean, they don't call themselves as farmers. They are calling mostly Adivasis, and hence their relationship with forests is more prominent, and hence the request for looking at development skilling in a very different fashion for tribals.
Thank you. Could I ask a follow-up question? I'm thinking obviously of hearing Trent earlier in the panel talking about, in a sense, more engagement to the formal skills system. Do you see any prospects in the Adivasi community becoming more engaged with the formal system, or are there more dangers than likely benefits for them in engaging with the formal skills system?
So first one is whether they will be able to engage with the formal system.
Yeah.
That itself is a big question mark. One is that there is no natural aptitude towards picking up, say, mobile repairing or poultry farming. I mean, these poultry farming and goatery and mushroom culture are the conventional agricultural extension that have happened and gone. Like, it will exist for 2-3 years and they are gone. So it's not really changing something very consistently for a long term. So they don't feel actually threatened, but they actually are not even thinking about it or deliberating about it, because we should remember that we also have managed to erode and vanish their institutions of knowledge generation and deliberations. So wherever they exist, like the person who is supposed to think about when to sow a crop or when to do the harvest, that position still exists. He or his family is known after that, but even that family doesn't have the skills, or they're not even consulted on those aspects. So those are dysfunctional institutions. So it is a neither there nor here existence. So.
Yeah. And I wonder if I could maybe ask a further question that in a sense is to you and Trent. So, we've had the whole massive skilling of India, and Trent talked about the 400 million, and at one stage the number was even bigger in the first statements from the government. So we've had this massive ambition from the Modi government about skilling, which on one level is positive, but a lot of what I hear is quite negative about its reach, not even in the urban areas, but particularly in these rural settings. So where do you think that whole initiative stands now, particularly in rural areas? Was it just a great PR victory for the Prime Minister that look what I'm doing, and the reality is very different on the ground? What is the legacy, or what will be the legacy, do you think?
I just want to say one thing before giving it to Trent. One, Indian rural area is not one monolithic landscape or social scape. It is, very diverse. Two, even when we talk about agricultural skills, we need to be bothered about diversity of agricultural skills needed. So people like tribals, their actual remaining possibility of self-employment is only this marginal farming, but then the skills needed for that farming is not what a mainstream farmer in the peri-urban India or even rural agrarian society needs. So with that caveat, I think I will hand over to Trent for responding.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the target-driven approach that characterized the beginning of the Skill India initiative has been very problematic in terms of implementation of the programs. It's meant that there's this excessive focus on the number of people trained, and you see that percolate all the way down to the administrative level, where the focus is just on the just making sure you have full enrollments, rather than on the quality of the impact that you have on any kind of follow-up to ensure that people are benefiting from the skills that they've gained. And I think it's kind of telling that the Modi government has abandoned those large targets, which I don't know, I suspect may have been more of a PR exercise than ever something anyone really expected would be met. I think what we can see in rural areas is that a lot of people in rural areas are sort of picking up training in sort of hub towns for skills that are relevant in the urban sector. And one paper that I've read recently looked at how the job placements that they could get were all very far away from their homes. Often in large metropolitan centers, which were the only places that could do the paperwork necessary to do placements or to pay minimum wage. So I think the whole thing's been quite fraught.
Great, thanks. Gina's got a question for you, and I was just tempted to ask her the question back. So you can try and get Gina up onto the panel as well, if that's okay.
I'll try. 1 second.
Yeah, I was trying, but
I've got it. There we go.
You've got it. Hi, Gina. Do you want to ask your question? And then I was going to ask it back to you in the Philippines setting.
Okay, so I'm not sure.
Right. Yeah. Hi, Gina. Can you hear us now?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Now we've got you.
My question is about the integration of local or indigenous knowledge in your practice. How do agricultural training programs in India, in particular, integrate or recognize the indigenous practices of farmers?
Shall I take it, or Trent?
I think
this is probably more.
Okay. One is that indigenous skills are never even considered in these programs. The skills that actually fall under the primary sector of agriculture confines to what the mainstream academic institutions in agriculture can offer. So mostly they are around what Trent was mentioning, mushroom culture, and sometimes improved hybrid varieties of goat or poultry. But there is a parallel initiative to extend skills for organic farming, which is like certified organic farming for the urban consumer. Indigenous skills or indigenous farming has never been considered at all in these skilling initiatives. And incidentally, in the 3 villages we have been living almost for the past 3 years, there is no single person who got any training in any of these programs under ASCI.
Right, thanks. Trent, have you anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, in the agricultural skills programs that I've been looking at, the curricula are developed in a very centralized sort of way. So you have them sort of made by this, skills council based in Delhi. There is some scope to adjust the curriculum based on the local settings, but I haven't seen anywhere, and it might just be that I haven't come across it, but I haven't seen in any of the curricula any suggestion that local knowledge should be something that the trainers should be engaging with. In fact, I think local knowledge is sort of assumed as something that these programs are trying to overcome, to try and bring in more scientific knowledge. The one exception might be in the organic farming training, where there's a little bit more engagement with, indigenous traditions. But even then, I think it would more be replacing that with a more scientific model.
Yeah, and Gina, could I throw the question back to you again? You have, with TESDA, you have a very strong, relatively national agency. Does it leave any space for the local and the indigenous?
Actually, that's the gap that I observed, that we discovered in our research, and that is the gap that we are trying to address, because we are using the mainstream curriculum, and we are using the mainstream materials. That's why we are actually advocating for the use of and the recognition of indigenous knowledge, including the resource. Tapping the trainers from the local communities or from the indigenous communities. So we would like to document these things and integrate this in the materials. So we are advocating actually for the contextualization and localization of training materials, because we are using the mainstream curriculum.
Great. Well, thank you to the three of you, and of course to Kudu, who unfortunately isn't here. There's a fascinating range of issues, particularly this one that we're just opening up is one that I would love to talk more about. But I'm conscious that we're sort of running to the end of our time. We do have a second panel that Trent might want to say something about just before we leave. That we'll come back to some of these issues, but I'd really like to thank the three of you for presentations I've really been stimulated about. I need to read the PowerPoints more carefully and think about them, but I look forward to coming back to all of you with further questions, because I think there's fascinating work here. So thank you very much. Trent, do you want to say a final thing? And
yeah, thanks.
On to the next session.
Sure. Thanks everyone for coming in, for putting up with the technical issues that we were facing earlier. Please come along to the next session. It's after the break, and in the next set of speakers will be focusing again on this social ecosystems concept. We have another presentation looking at demand-driven approaches to rural development and skill development, and then another that's looking at entrepreneurship for agritourism. So please come along to that.
Great. So thank you to everyone, and we'll hopefully see you all. Is that 11:15?
Yes, 11:15.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Thanks for now.
Yes. Here during the first session, I might just reiterate that the rationale for this panel is that while we've seen skill development and reform of vocational education and training systems emerge as a major policy priority across the Global South, the focus of both policy and academic research has tended to be urban-centric on skills provision for the industrial and service sectors. So the papers that are presenting today are looking at what skill development and vocational training might offer for people in rural settings in the Global South, and some of the issues that are associated with that. So this panel was organized by Anna Robinson-Punt and myself. Unfortunately, Anna has experienced some disruptions because of COVID, so couldn't make it today. But I'd like to thank her for the work she's done in helping to organize this. And I'd also like to thank Simon McGrath for stepping up to facilitate our first session of the panel this morning in Anna's absence, and for enduring the numerous technical difficulties that we faced. Okay, so our first presenter this morning is Sidney Moe Hangi. So Sidney is a PhD student from Rhodes University in South Africa. He's doing a lot of interesting research related to skills ecosystems and extension. And his presentation today, which is a video presentation, is titled "Towards a Social Ecosystemic Approach to Researching Rural Skills."
Greetings. My name is Sidney Moe Hangi, a scholar at the Environmental Learning Research Center, Rhodes University. I'll be presenting this paper that I co-authored with Professor Hayla, Dr. Prisha, and Professor Simon, and it's entitled "The Social Skills Ecosystem Approach to Workstream Mapping for VET Africa 4.0 Research." And it gives initial insights from the Agriculture Advisory Services workstream. So we'll begin by looking at the evolution of vocational education and training in Africa. Then next we'll look at the social skills ecosystem approach, and later look at how this approach applies and aligns with the new thinking of VET 4.0. They later look at occupations and work streams as units of skill planning and development in VET, and then look at why we choose work streams of occupations, and then present emerging findings from the cases, and finally the study implications. So talking about the evolution of VET in Africa, this has gone through three major phases. They are the modernization, the basic needs, and the neoliberalism phases. To give a brief overview about these, the first one began in a period between the 1940s and 60s when the African states were gaining independence from the colonialists. And the focus of this type of VET was to provide extensive local schooling in the African states and industrialization. And these were to help African states to achieve an economic takeoff stage and at the same time get the skills, especially medium to high, to replace the expatriates that were working in Africa at that time. The second one was the basic needs. This came as a result of fears and concerns from the African states that the policies of the first VET, such as extensive schooling, would lead to educated employment. And the calls to reform that led to the basic needs phase. And that type of VET was to ensure that basic needs were provided, and these included the rural skills and training for the urban and informal sector. This was later found to be ineffective, especially when the World Bank figured out through its research, and they decided to reform it together with the Education for All, and they gave priority to primary education. This unfortunately was at the expense of VET and higher education in Africa. And that is why, when it did not work well, the World Bank decided to spearhead a reform of this, which led to the third VET, or the neoliberalism phase. So the neoliberalism phase of VET started after the decline of the basic needs phase, and this was spearheaded by the World Bank that introduced the new conditions for continued lending to Africa. And it was based on the neoliberal ideas that increased the role of private sector in the economy and society, and were agitating for reductions in government spending. And because of this, the World Bank tied its funding to new aspects such as outcome-based funding and competencies based on curricula and national qualification frameworks. And during 2000, when the Millennium Development Goals, the Education for All, which was planning for the VET sector, for instance, it did not include very important aspects such as sustainable consumption, production, decent work, and green skills, for instance. And because of this, it left the VET sector in Africa very underdeveloped and not aligned to the realities of the African economies. And because of this, there have been calls, especially from McGrath and his friends, that there should be a new form of VET that aligns with the new Sustainable Development Goals and takes care of the aspects that weren't included in the Millennium Development Goals, as an example. So that's why today we're talking about the new form of VET, which is VET 4.0, that we'll talk about later on. So taking you back to the main aim of the paper was to do workstream mapping for agriculture advisory services, our main focus. And we specifically chose the social skills ecosystem approach because it aligns with the thinking of the emerging VET 4.0. So this model was wrote by Hodgson and Spores, and according to this model, it brings a variety of partners into a relationship of working, living, and learning. So the model says that the support institutions, which they call facilitating verticalities, such as systematic influences like SDGs or national policy and regulatory frameworks or local government structures, they work together with anchor institutions such as TVET colleges or even community associations, mediated by a 45-degree activity or research, and these may include socialized digital technologies or education practices involving skills within a social ecosystem. And so, we're confident that this model will be helpful in developing methodology for green skills and vet research. So in the previous slide, we said that the social skills ecosystems aligns with the thinking of the emerging VET 4.0. So to understand what this thinking of VET 4.0 is, it is centered on three core elements. First, it transforms institutional, evolutionary, and economic traditions to facilitate economic growth. And in this, it believes that skills are acquired and utilized socially, and that state and intermediary organizations are involved in skills development. This aligns to the thinking of the social skills ecosystems, which brings a variety of partners into a relationship of working, living, and learning. Except that the social skills ecosystems understand that they are multiple partners, and what it does is it seeks to bring them into rational connectivity to develop skills. The second element is that it draws from the human development and capabilities approach, and if applied to VET, it will develop a more robust of agency that takes account of structural impediments to agency. And the third one is that it's concerned about the future of the planet and inclusive development. And these include sustainable production and consumption practices, and also meeting the needs of the poor. So similarly, social skills ecosystems transforms combination economies by linking intermediate, low, and high skills for inclusive economic growth. So to remind you, our study was doing workstreams mapping in the Agriculture Advisory Services. And we're interested in work streams because occupations have not lived to the expectations, especially regarding VET skills planning and development. So although occupations have been used previously as a unit of analysis for skills planning and development in VET, they are known to be having very many challenges, including being inflexible, having tensions and internal contradictions, and also being temporary. So as a result, we argue that there's a need to deconstruct occupations as a unit of analysis for skills planning and development in VET to work streams. So coming back to the question of work streams, why work streams, not occupations? The work stream combines shared knowledge, which is the core knowledge, and skills from diverse educational backgrounds and qualifications to perform similar activities and tasks that are shared by specializations of occupations within a broader field of practice. And as opposed to occupations, work streams allow lateral and vertical movement of labor, they allow transitioning across occupations, and they are flexible, so they can allow the emergence of new pathways in different dimensions and sectors. And so work streams would really be would provide a very useful analytical framework for green skills, and they will be very important for VET in developing skills. So this was a cross-case comparative study between the two sites, one in Eastern Cape, South Africa, and the other one in Gulu in northern Uganda. But I would like us to pay attention to two forms of statistics here. One is unemployment, and another one is the percentage of households involved in agriculture. In Alice, in South Africa, 26.5% of the households are involved in agriculture, compared to Gulu, where 53% are involved. And unemployment in Alice is 45.6% compared to 56.2% in Gulu. Although these statistics are not conclusive, but at least they shed light on the importance of agriculture to people's livelihoods in form of income and food. And so it's very important that the skills are developed in the agricultural ecosystem in both cases, because agriculture forms a very significant part of people's livelihoods. So to take you through the process of mapping work streams into that methodology, firstly, this is still evolving, and secondly, we did not do in-field interviews due to COVID limitations, but fortunately the available documentation and other literature helped to shape the process of doing work streams mapping. So we did a market segmentation, and that was zeroing down to the agriculture industry, and after that in the agriculture industry we did a value chain analysis to try and identify the actors and other partners that are involved in agriculture advisory services. And then we went down to examining variables using the existing frameworks, such as the Organizational Framework for Occupations and other equivalents. Then after that we analyzed sector reports and job advancement in the field of agriculture advisory services to try and identify the common skills sought, qualifications, and other knowledge in that field. And then later, finally, we had to link the common variables like skills and core knowledge, competencies, qualifications into specialty areas in order to form the work streams. So looking at the emerging findings from the two cases, especially regarding the social skills ecosystems available, in ALICE we were able to find an existing social learning network, and this was mediated by players such as the Environmental Learning Research Center and the Fort Cox Agriculture Training Institute. So these were working with other support institutions such as the Local Economic Development Agency and other anchor institutions or horizontal collaborations from the Raymond Mahlaba Development Agency and other farmer associations. We also found that there were socializing technologies that are facilitating virtual learning, and this was provided by the Imvoto Bomi or Water for Life Learning Network WhatsApp group and a community radio. And through this relationship with the stakeholders involved, there was a curriculum innovation at Fort Cox Agriculture Training Institute. And in the Gulu case, we found that there was a student farmer attachment model, and the mediating players of this model was the Gulu University Faculty of Agriculture and the Regional Universities Forum for Capacity Building in Agriculture. And the facilitating verticalities in this relationship was the MasterCard Foundation, and in this relationship they were working with local farmer entrepreneurs who were facilitating student learning and vice versa. We, however, were not able to determine any socialized technologies that were facilitating virtual learning, and we were able to determine that there were curricular changes and innovation through this kind of student farmer attachment learning experiences. So we believe that the future studies should be able to determine other things happening in these two cases, especially if in-field interviews are involved. And for the agriculture advisory workstream, these specialities were identified. They include horticulture, animal husbandry, agricultural economics, agricultural lending, procurement, logistics and management, agricultural extension research, climate resilience, and precision farming. And these were done in a context of such as small-scale farming, agricultural finance, extension research and innovation, dryland agriculture, and commercial farming. And this work stream would make it easier for VET to do targeted skills development in each specialty, and it would facilitate or would allow work transitioning and lateral or vertical movement of labor into these specialty areas. So the implications of this study from a development perspective include they may help to understand how features within a context influence the success of a policy initiative or program. and also the results may provide valuable information that can be used to tailor interventions or policy to support achievement of planned outcomes, and may generate generalizable knowledge about causal questions like how and why certain policies or programs work or fail, and the results may facilitate knowledge transfer or best practices across cases, and it may inform curriculum development to allow greater flexibility and agility in transitioning from college to workplace and within workplace amongst specializations. I look forward to interacting with you and answering your questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sidney. That was very informative. So we will leave Q&A until the end of this session, but I would like to just let you all know that if at any time you want to send a question through, you can put something through using the question button at any time. Okay, so our second speaker today is Sebastian Schneider. Sebastian is a research associate and PhD candidate within the Chair of Economics and Business Education at the University of Cologne. His research interests include international vet research, skill development in rural areas, and the perceived value of vocational education and training. And today he's going to be presenting a paper on demand-driven approaches as the key to sustainable skills development in the agricultural sector, experiences from Meghalaya, India. So I'll just bring Sebastian up now.
Cologne in Germany. I'm very happy to be part of the conference and having the chance to present our research from our research institute in the northeastern state of Meghalaya in India. I will talk today about 3 researches we did. The first is about skill assessment, demand-drivenness, to find out what are the needs of the people in the Northeast. The second study is about a study of pineapple farmers in Meghalaya to find out how did they acquire their skills. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about the implementation of the measures. One colleague of mine, Ms. Wessels, went to Shillong, the capital of Meghalaya, and taught the people, the teachers there, about didactics and pedagogy. So for 20 minutes time, I hope I can show you as much as possible. Okay, so I heard you can hear me, but the slides are not showing at the moment. So I just start and I'm waiting for the slides to go on. So my topic is about demand-drivenness in Meghalaya. And I will talk about those projects. So as you all know, India is coming in the threshold, becoming the most populous country on earth, is undergoing a process of economic, social, and societal transformation. There's a huge rural population, and only a very small amount of people have participated in formal training. So I started a project in Meghalaya in cooperation with the Center of Modern Indian Studies of the University of Cologne and the Ministry of Agriculture in the northeastern state of Meghalaya. For us, it was important to first assess the skills and what the people in the state of Meghalaya really need in regard to vocational training. So for us, it's the first step for successful and sustainable implementation of the training measures. Yes, so Meghalaya is one of the 7 sister states in the northeast. It's one of the most untapped and underdeveloped regions of India. Around about 3 million people live in the northeast, 80% in rural areas. Many of the people there are living in a tribal society. 65% are working in the agricultural sector. Literacy rate is 75%. similar to the rest of India. And yeah, the population is mostly trained in informal way. That's what we knew about Meghalaya, and that's maybe very important to know. So coming next to demand and supply driven approach. As you may know, supply driven approach is dominant in India, but not very effective. It's a very top-down method coming from the central government. Meghalaya is quite far away from Delhi, so the top-down method won't work that good. There's a qualitative and quantitative mismatch, and those approaches, for example, in Meghalaya, don't provide promising perspectives for the students. So that's why demand-driven approaches are increasingly taking into account. The World Bank recommended them as well. So they should be adjusted to the needs of the participants. It's a change of the perspective. The learner, the student, is coming into the focus. So it's a bottom-up method. As you may think about it, it's a resource-intensive task. It's very difficult to go to the regions and ask the people, but I think it's worth it. And when you come to the demand-driven approach on the next slide, you will see there are two phases of the demand. It's not only the demand of the potential employees, individual-driven, but also industrial-driven. Involving those two sides is important. In my study, we focus on the individual-driven perspective. And for the research design, we went to the villages and had focus group discussions with many people in several villages. Afterwards, we had problem-oriented one-on-one interviews in order to deepen the interesting aspects. And thirdly, we also interviewed some experts from the chambers of commerce in Meghalaya to mirroring the answers and having a deeper insight. So I had 12 interviews in 12 villages of the major regions, Riboy, Garo Hill, and Jainta Hills, 7 focus group discussions, each 8 to 15 participants, and 2 interviews with members of the Chamber of Commerce. Coming to the specificities of Meghalaya, since it's a tribal area, we had to work with interpreters since the people speaking their language Ghazi or Garo, and the interviews were recorded. So coming to the findings, what do we find out? The chambers, we divided it into agricultural and non-agricultural vocational needs. Chamber of Commerce, we're mainly talking about the needs as handcraft, procession of bamboo, food processing, juice and marmalade production, and also the need of car mechanics, tailoring, factory workers, electrician, and carpenters. Agricultural needs more or less is chicken and pig farming. That was important for us to mirror the findings we found out in the different districts. And coming now to the findings from the people in Riboy, non-cultural and agricultural. It's since it's a very agricultural state, food processing is very important, but also commercial skills such as marketing. The people as we see in the next step, mostly they know how to plant their food in agriculture, how to harvest it, but they had big problems in market their goods, and most of the benefit was not with them, but most of the benefit was going to the wholesalers they sold their crops to. So commercial skills are very important. Apart from fruit processing, weaving is one major thing, mostly the women doing. So they have a very old tradition of weaving, which is very old, hundreds of years old, but they were telling that it's not possible to sell it on the market anymore because they don't have the up-to-date designs or dyeing techniques. So weaving was very important. Tailoring and as well handicrafts. In an agricultural way, efficient planting was one thing they wanted to know more about, and also pig rearing. Similar findings we had from Garo Hills, but there's as well silkworm production is a very interesting thing. They could harvest or collect the silkworms from the forest and the woods in Garo Hills, but they didn't have the techniques to extract the silk from the silkworm. So as you can imagine, if you sell the silkworm to a different area, you just get a small amount, but extracting the silk from the silkworm is the most beneficial part. So the people were very unsatisfied in not knowing about this technique. Similar to Riboy is that scientific methods and technology about agriculture and farming was very important for them, since they just learned their vocation farming from their forefathers. So they didn't have any formal knowledge and they wanted to upgrade it. In Jacinta Hills, more people were telling about, for example, more knowledge about electrician, mechanics, or bakers. Many youngsters were talking about becoming a car mechanic, but also talking with the Chamber of Commerce, it became clear that there's not the highest demand on car mechanics because Meghalaya is a very rural state, not so many cars are there. So, but that's the ambition of the more younger people. Post-harvest work is important, electrician, furniture production, as well as storage of the agricultural products, and as well the marketing, calculating prices, calculating discounts, for example, profits and losses. So they have a knowledge, but on a very basic level, and helping them with those informations would help them as well. Also in the agricultural part, pest, diseases, and control, getting to know what's happening, how you can avoid diseases and such as things. So that's just for a little insight into the findings. And we had some recommendations for the agricultural department of the ministry. So we recommended them to implement agricultural skills in planting, harvesting, but also on food processing. So food processing is very important to increase the durability and increase the profits when selling on the market. For example, you can expand the time range where you can sell your products. For example, making marmalade or jam out of the pineapples. Weaving skills, silkworm breeding, handicraft, and additionally, where it is a demand from the demand side, car mechanics, mechanics in general, carpenters, tailors, woodworkers, or bakers. Many people told me that they don't know where they can become an electrician, for example, if there's happening something to an electrical device. They have to call someone from far away, who has to drive for 3 or 4 hours, and they want to have it like in their own area. But additional to the basic skills, many more things are possible and necessary. Additional skills like the awareness training, for example, to give an orientation what is even possible in the state of Meghalaya, since most of the people are in rural areas, they're living in the villages, they don't even know about the possibilities they are possible, for example, in Shillong, in the capital, that there are training institutes, industrial training institutes, for example, where they can get basic skills of the demanded knowledge, but they are not aware of that. As I already mentioned, commercial skills on a very basic level, but they are very important. Entrepreneurial skills, knowledge of marketing, strengthening the business thinking, and modern technologies like patterns or how to work with machines. How to do it in a structural way, since the people are highly involved in agriculture and they're working 10 to 12 or even more hours a day in agriculture. They have a very limited time range to learn and access more skills. So for us, modularization is a very important thing. So don't do a very long course, for example, but try to put it in modules so you can upgrade it on a level on a later time. Having various levels, starting with the basic level, upgraded, advanced, expert, offer it on a modular way. It's important to have it in local language courses. It's a very various language landscape. If you ignore this fact and teach in English or in Hindi, you will not be. It would not be possible to teach something. Strong practical focus is very important. The residents have a very clear and concrete questions about what they want to know. They have everyday problems, so practical focus is important. But as I mentioned, theoretical basis is also very, very important to getting a business idea, marketing, how to sell goods and stuff. Also, looking on the hours where they can come. For example, in the winter, it's more. It would be more beneficial for them because there is no harvesting season, for example, or courses which are happening in the evening, for example. So those are all small details, but could be very important when implementing a course. Coming to the infrastructure, you have to cluster the training courses. The people have to come to a specific cluster from the various areas, and maybe it's an idea to also combine it with a production area. For example, the marmalade and jam producing. The people want to know how to produce the jam and marmalade, and they want to do it, but they don't have the machinery for it. So combining a cluster for training, teaching how to do it, and having the possibility to do it at the premises would be good. And also transporting is an important thing. Yes, supportive structures, the promotion between the various stakeholders, the schools, the companies, the banks. Of course, banks is important when they want to buy machinery. cooperation with the companies and such, and also effective consulting and the assessment of the people, what they really need, in cooperation with the Ministry of Agriculture. So the conclusion and outlook. The aim of the study was to get to know a first insight what the people in Meghalaya really need. And on the next steps, implement some training measures. So the next steps are curriculum development, teacher training, feasibility of the evaluation. So that was the first step, demand and assessment in Meghalaya. Later on, I come back to that point, but on the next step, we had another study, and it was on a specific part of the farmers. It's on the pineapple farmers in Meghalaya, which is a very big point in Meghalaya. And my colleague went up there, and she wanted to know what kind of skill set do the pineapples farmers have, and how did they acquire their skills. So she did also some focus group discussions and interviews. So as we found out, and as we also had the imagination, the farmers didn't have much of a formal education in vocational education and training. And they also told that they have no need of formal education. The farmers are happy that they can finance general education for their children, but they are not in the need to have formal education for themselves. How did they gain skills? The Department of Agriculture and Horticulture is giving lessons in so-called horti hubs. Most farmers are interested in upgrading their skills, but they have not a deep knowledge in marketing skills. So they are happy as far as the costs are covered, but if there's happening something, they don't have a deeper knowledge how to solve those problems. And in the demand, as I also found out, food processing is very important. But we found out, since they don't have formal knowledge, they also have a very high set of skills. But the farmers gain their knowledge from the forefathers and the families, but they don't have deeper scientific knowledge. So like self-reflection about how or why. So since there are only 2 minutes left, I come to the implementation of the measures. So my colleague Antje Wessels went up to Shillong with the knowledge we gained about the demand and what the people want to know. And she trained some trainers in the Northeast in an industrial training institute. And she was there in August 2015. And she told the teachers what is important about didactics, strengthening the training structures, what is hands-on training, and she talked about basic ideas of pedagogy and didactics. So, for example, the teachers have to bring the intention and the content. They have to bring methods and media. They have to keep in mind the socioeconomic background and the anthropogenic conditions. So tailor-made training programs are important, and they're helping the trainers to strengthen their teaching. Yeah. So for introducing new contents to the rural people, to the farmer, it's firstly essential the why, how, and who is in front of the class. All right, in a very short number of time, I tried to present you the 3 studies we did in the Northeast. First, assessing the demand of the people. Secondly, finding out how they acquire their skills. And thirdly, talking about teaching and what is important for the teachers in the Northeast. So later on, I'm very happy to answer you some questions about this topic.
That was really great. Okay, so our final speaker for today is Navjot Sandhu. So sorry, I have just lost my file for a second. Right, so Navjot is Associate Professor in Finance at Birmingham City University. Her research to date is focused on bank lending decisions to small and medium farmers in India. And her presentation today asks, can entrepreneurship education and training assist women entrepreneurs make agritourism a success story in India? So I'll just bring Navjot onto the stage. Okay, there you are. So nice to have you here. Unfortunately, we've had a problem uploading files that weren't already uploaded before. So I'm not sure if I can get your slides up, but perhaps you can start your presentation and I'll keep trying.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank
you, Jonathan. Nice to see you. Good afternoon, everyone. My today's presentation is about Indian agriculture, and the thing which I'm going to talk about is agri-tourism and how it can help Indian agriculture, which is especially agriculture from the state of India, Punjab, which is continuously declining, and how we can revive that. Which stakeholders can help to revive that agriculture sector and increase its input. So this paper is about, here I'm saying that, can entrepreneurship, education and training assist women entrepreneurs to make agritourism a success story in India? Let me provide you a brief background before I get into the nitty-gritty of this paper. Because my PhD was about Indian agriculture, and I've been continuously, after finishing my PhD, I've been continuously scanning this sector, and I've seen that this sector is declining, and especially in Indian Punjab, which is mainly agri-based economy, and its productivity is declining. There are various factors which are contributing to that. One factor is that because due to green revolution, we used, when I'm saying we in Indian Punjab, and farmers used adopted innovative technologies. They used chemical fertilizers to enhance their agricultural productivity. And consequently, consequently, we managed to increase the agriculture productivity and our income over there. However, we forgot to, because previously what used to happen that these farmers, after sowing paddy and rice, in between they used to sow these nitrogenous products which can enhance agricultural productivity, such as they use to sow grams and other pulses. But because by sowing rice and paddy, they were getting more income, and they came out of that cycle, and consequently the productivity of the soil has decreased. Yeah, although we've been massively using all the chemical fertilizer. And then what is happening as the productivity is decreasing, and if we look at the young population over there, they are not ready to stick with agriculture. Yeah, if you look at the Indian Punjab, I don't know how much you are familiar with the youth of the Indian Punjab. They don't want to stay there. They want to go abroad. They think that they have better future over there rather than being in India and doing the agriculture. So, and there are various other things coming up in Punjab because of low productivity. Those who are here, they are, because if you
sorry, may I just stop you for a second? We're having trouble hearing you, so perhaps you might want to switch the camera off. It might increase the audio quality.
Okay.
Yeah, and I've got your slides up, so are we on the right slide here? Should we be on the literature review?
Yeah, here. Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. So.
Sorry about that.
Can you?
I hear you now. Please carry on.
Okay. So then what is happening? The youth, they don't like to stay there, and obviously they don't want to get involved into the agriculture sector. So there are multiple factors which are affecting this agriculture sector at the moment. And then, yeah, I'm very much attached to this topic because I come from that background. And then then what I did, I started doing some research. I said, okay, I need to see, because what happened in the European countries when the agriculture productivity over there declined, and what happened in North America. And then I came across this agritourism. A few years ago, I went to Finland for a conference, and then they took us in a forest for our conference dinner, and there I was really impressed the way they presented their heritage and their that rural background by taking us to that place for dinner. Then I got interested in this agritourism and in this heritage thing. And then when I did studies related to these 12 countries, European and North and Latin America, I found that when the agriculture productivity was declining, then they used agritourism in order to supplement their income. Then I thought, hang on a second, if that can happen in those countries, then can we use the same model in Indian Punjab? And then I started doing some more research about this. I said, okay, I need to see that has anyone done any research in case of Indian Punjab? And I started looking at that, and I found that there is some rudimentary research being done. For example, people are still looking at identifying the potential of agritourism. They are still looking at the research is at the initial stage. They are saying that whether we can, there is any scope of agritourism, and then I say, you know what, there is a major gap here, because agritourism, I thought, you know, in my previous research, I looked at the role of women in agriculture, because they are the invisible helping hand. And then I said, hang on a second, why them lot can't help over here? And they can if they, because they've been helping in the agriculture sector, they are the invisible hand, their contribution has not been recognized, then why they can't help here? Yeah, I don't want them to stay invisible. I want their contribution to be recognized, and because they are working hard in order to make that agriculture a success. Then I thought, okay, I need to dig more into this, and then we'll talk to those people whether they are happy to take it or not. Obviously, I'm not the one who will be implementing this, but I'm thinking that these things because at this stage we can't just say, okay, the agriculture productivity is the soil productivity is low, and then we can't make that land barren. We need to find some other ways in order to enhance our income, and in order to make in order to preserve our inheritance, and in order to move away from the traditional stuff and to do something different. And then I said, okay, because these women, their contribution is massive, and they can help in order to transform this sector. And then I managed to design some testable questions as they are appearing on the screen, that the first one was, does agriculture, agritourism complement or compete traditional farming? So we will see in a bit that what came from my initial finding. This is still my work in progress. Yeah, and these are my initial findings, but I'm doing more analysis on this. And then another thing, I said, okay, can women agripreneurs make agritourism a success in India? I use this agripreneur word intentionally because we don't, even in my previous research paper, I use this word because we don't acknowledge their contribution. Yeah. And then the next question, testable question is, what is the relationship between gender, access to entrepreneurial education, and agritourism progress in this emergent entrepreneurial ecosystem? So there is much more than this. When I started with this, then we can look at this from different perspectives, and different things are emerging from that, from finance side, from gender side, from entrepreneurial ecosystem side, from the entrepreneurial educational side. So I try to put my initial thoughts here, and I will be happy to receive your feedback on that in order to improve my future work. So what I did initially, in order to test the market, I went to farmers around, and then I sent this because I did survey with them, and I tried to contact 300 farmers, but 100 farmers, they didn't reply at all, and then 200, I managed to contact them. I think which is a really good response rate. The reason I got response from them, because again, it was through personal networking, family networking, some recommendations from some people, and then there is this Punjab Heritage Tourism Promotion Board in India. So I contacted them as well, and they. On there, I thought on this promotion board there will be more members, but there are members registered over there, but there are only 20 members which are active, and they said, okay, I can contact them. Yeah, and then I can contact them for future research. I tried to contact some of them, but some of them they were not interested in this research. And they said, and there were various issues as well, because when it comes to finances, arranging for finances and type of income they were reluctant to answer all those questions. So I do, because when you do this survey, when you do this focus group and interviews, you find these problems over there. And because what else I found, that those who are not into agritourism as well, and especially young population, and especially women, yeah, because if you look at the next slide, the demographics of my sample, you see that the females in Indian Punjab are more educated than the males. Yeah, and they are more keen. They are very enthusiastic. They really want to do something. What they are doing, they are getting master qualification. They are doing graduation, but they are not acquiring relevant skills. That's what I found. Not many of them have these entrepreneurial education. I found a big gap over there. But they were very interested. And if I look at and if I tell you about the too, they were their response was not very good. And when I was, because when I was asking them that, look, you got, because they have very precious things over there which they can use in order to attract the tourism. When I'm saying tourist, not only the foreign tourist. When I started my presentation, I said that many of the Punjabis, they are migrating abroad. Those who are going abroad, when they are visiting family, they can take their kids with them, and they can take them to those places in order to tell them about their heritage. I said, be these, and there is a scope for that. Women were happy, but men, especially male, which were in the age of 40 to 55, they said no. Reason? They gave me the reasons as well. And because we know, all of us know what's been happening in the world over last few years, that again, especially in case of India, we have seen the rape cases and all those. And I think those things are also affecting the mindset of the people. Yeah, definitely, we don't want to improve our women. On the other hand, women, they want to participate in this type of thing. They said no, because if outsider will come, and then they can if they will say anything to our wives, our sisters, and or if they will come into our properties, then our sisters, our daughters, our the spouses, they are not safe. So there were various issues coming up, and then although this agri-tourism, it can, I told them that it can enhance their, it can diversify their, they agreed with that. Yeah, it can improve their agricultural production, they agreed with that. It can strengthen the sustainability of the small farms. These small farms, that's another thing, because of land fragmentation, land is getting divided into amongst the families, and then the share of the land is becoming small. So there are becoming small parcels of land. So in order to make it viable, which is not viable for farming, then they can use these, adopt these alternative sources. My first question was whether it can complement, agri-tourism can complement or compete with agriculture. The answer which I got from my analysis was that it, as many farmers, especially the male, they were not ready to participate in this. Yes, it can complement their, supplement their income. It can be used as a supplementary source, yeah, in order to enhance the income. But again, in order to, because as I told you that farmers, they were apprehensive about the outsider visiting their properties and engaging with them, and then security. And then I said, you can install cameras, those things. There are various ways which you can keep an eye, you can do your job, you can earn money, and then you can look after the safety as well. Then they said, look, in order to do those things, you need money. So finance, another thing, that was a big issue. Because in my sample, there were 5 females, they said, oh, we want to do that. And then I could see some conflict arising between their spouses and them. And then I said, no, I don't want, because here we are just saying it can be a good alternative. It can complement your income. If you will do this. They said, okay, we are ready to do this, but we need money. So financing is another thing. And when those females, they said, no, it doesn't matter what happens, we want to start this business. But then again, because with those females, because they don't, obviously when they will go to the bank, they need a collateral to pledge. And if you are, okay, 5 minutes, yeah. And again, if you look at the females, not many females, they have the ownership of the land. They don't have the property to pledge. The properties are on the name of either the husband, father, or brother. Not many females have that. So that's another issue I found through this research, that they don't have acquired collateral, as they can't access the formal sources of finance. Yes, they are graduates, but they haven't got those acquired skills. And when I was talking to them, they said they are ready to, especially females, they said they are ready to take those. But then they asked me about the institutions which provide that type of education. And because I've been talking to some universities as well, and what I found that there is a gap. Okay, the type of, again, still we are sticking with the fundamentals, we are providing that education, we are looking at the vocational education, which should meet the demands. We are not, even they are just following the formal route. I know some will be disagreeing with this, but I think the universities, they need to revise their curriculum. Okay, these polytechnics, they need to revise their forces as well. And because there are people, there is a manpower. What they need to do over there, that we can't sit idle. We need to change these things and we need to put those things into use, that manpower into use. The strength of India is its population. Okay, if you provide them right skills, then if you will provide them the resources, then I think that's agri-tourism. It can be a success in a country like India, and especially when the females, if they think they are secure, if their families think that they have that type of security, and then if they will contribute into this, then it can be a success story like these countries like Europe, like Latin America. Yes, there will be some issues. Those issues can be addressed. But my recommendation is that policymakers, they need to look into that. These governments need to look, India, Punjabi government need to look into that. But I haven't heard anything from them. And you know what? As a researcher, I'm passionate. As all of you are, I was hearing some of the presentation. All of us are very passionate about our research, but our hands are so tight that we can't do anything. There are other people. Things to people, and it's up to other people whether they want to take these things on board or not. Okay, so there is much more to share, but I think by looking at the time, I finish it here, and I will really appreciate your feedback and your questions. Thank you very much.
On different issues like the importance of finance and the different kind of roadblocks that people face in using their skills. So we have about 25 minutes or 30 minutes for Q&A. So I'm just bringing the speakers back on stage. And if anybody has a question, could you please raise your hand or use the question button to submit a question? Okay, perhaps I'll start by asking a question for Sebastian. I had some thoughts about the focus on demand and the sort of slipperiness of the term demand, that it's used in vocational training policy and planning to refer to sort of the demands of employers, but it could equally be used to refer to the demands of trainees, and then possibly, like particularly when you're talking about entrepreneurial activities like agriculture, market demand matters as well, right? Like whether there's demand for the kind of entrepreneurial activities that they want to do. So what I'm wondering is whether in your experience, policymakers in India, those who you interviewed, sort of recognize this sort of multifaceted aspect of demand, or whether the focus tends to be just on employer demand.
As far as I knew it, or as I experienced it, it's more on the focus of the employer's demand. So mostly it's shifting from the supply-driven side, top-down, shifting to the demand-driven side. But I have the feeling that the employer's demand is much more important still than the employee's demand, or the demand of the students or the people seeking for education. So I think it's a much more it's a bigger change in really bringing the focus on the demand of the seekers of skills. So that's a new kind of thing, and I think it was a very important thing to do and bring those informations to the policymakers, what the students or the farmers really needed. Since there are not so many employers in Meghalaya and the northeastern state, and not many companies and such, I think it's a good way to do it like this in this state. But it depends on every region. Since it's very rural up there, I think the people are self-employed as farmers. It's really important to get to know their needs and how to upgrade their skills. But going to the questions, I think it tends more to be in general that the demand of the employers is more in the focus.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's been my experience too, and certainly framing things in terms of industry demand. Perhaps the definition of industry gets widened a little bit, but not necessarily the understanding of what demand might mean. Okay, we have one question here from Joanna Russon. Okay. So, thank you. Should universities play a greater role in skill development in the marginalized case contexts we've heard about today? If yes, how? So, Sidney, would you like to talk to that? Sebastian or Navjot, did you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, during my presentation, I mentioned that universities, they can contribute. They need to revise their curriculum because they need to see, look at the demand, what is required. Yeah, and the last year, because I'm an foreign visiting professor for some of the Indian universities, and I was talking to researchers over there, and I was saying, and even the quality team over there, I say you need to look at the demand. These things are required. These skills are required in order to boost up the economy. Then why not to design some courses in those directions? And you know what, with them, they were a bit apprehensive. They say, oh, you know what, because with Punjabi kids, they want to stay here, they want to go abroad. What if they will design and there won't be any demand? If they want, because they like to spend money and go to the foreign university to get degrees from there. And they were saying, what if no one will come, and that will be the wastage of resources. So I think something should be coming from the government universities. At least they should start with something, and then private institutions will join them. There are less in the market. There are less risk takers.
Right. Right.
Coming to the question, I think it's a very good question. In my case, I think it was very important that the government in Meghalaya was approaching us when it comes to skill development. So more and more there's an awareness that vocational education and training is very important, and the government in Meghalaya, which is a very small state in India, had the idea that it's going to be important, but without them approaching us to help them with the research about skill development, it would have been very difficult. So and I think it's very important to have a university on board or have research on board, since my study showed that the teachers in the industrial training institutes, so mostly of the vocational education and training happens, is not very up to date, even when it comes to a very low level of didactics, pedagogy, and stuff. So I think an involvement is very important of university when it comes to skill development, but the approach has to come from the specific regions. Otherwise, it's more difficult.
Right. Right.
Yes. Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, we're just trying to use my computer for Sydney.
Oh, okay, right.
Because he's struggling with sound. So I think you can go ahead with that question you had for him, and then he can respond.
Okay, okay. So Sidney, are you there?
Yes, I do.
So the question was about universities, and yeah, should universities play a greater role in skill development in the marginalized case contexts that we've heard about today? And if yes, how?
Yeah, absolutely. I think universities should do that because they are a hub for knowledge. And so they should play a role in developing skills in those areas. But what they need to do is to make sure that they tailor the needs, the skill needs in those communities or these cases, and also try to combine the scientific models with indigenous knowledge, which makes it easier for people, regardless of their level of education, to understand from the context of their own skills. And that's how we can include the new skills, adding to what they have, to develop better skills or new skills to help them in, for instance, agriculture. If it's about mechanization, how can they apply it basing on what they know and what the new skills that are being brought from research-based institutions like universities?
I suppose one of the issues that comes up is that in different contexts, universities have different mandates. So if you're looking at agricultural universities in India, skill development might be part of their mandate in the sense that it overlaps with extension. But other universities might see this as being very peripheral to their work. So I'm wondering if the university's sense of what their mandate is might restrict their ability to be active players in this. So Sydney, is in South Africa, is skill development something that universities are actively involved in?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because so most of these universities are located in areas, for instance, like Rhodes University is located in Eastern Cape, which is struggling, for instance, with climate change impacts. So I think it should be responding to challenges on the ground, because in the first place, that's what is expected of a university where knowledge is created, to permeate down to the communities that surround it. So that's, I think universities should be responding to local problems where they're located, using research to develop skills in the local context.
I'm interested in case of the Indian context. We heard something about the banking system. As I also heard that it's important to involve the banks for the rural development. What's a good way to approach the banks, or what's a good way to get in contact the farmers and the banks? Yeah, is there a way? It's a huge topic and yeah, highly discussed, but.
Yeah, so Navjot, a question for you.
It's not easy because with me, my PhD research was on agriculture and banking. Yeah? And when I approached these banks as a researcher, they were not welcoming. And then I have to use some personal networking. And then they were giving me time, and that's how you manage to get access. With the farmers, some of the farmers, especially small and marginal, it's easy to access them. Yeah, when it comes to large farmers, they don't entertain you. Yeah, until and unless you have some personal networking and some relationship with them, because especially about they're not open to discuss their financial matters. They don't want to discuss that. And even some of them were my relatives and extended families, their relatives, and then I went to other districts to use relatives from there to approach those people. And then what I was doing, using, and even for my research paper, when I go there, interview them, and then I try to use tape recorder. And these large farmers, they were asking me not to record anything. On the other hand, small and marginals, they were happy for me to record, because with them, they were thinking that I am the one who is going to take their issues forward and going to solve their problem. And I was really feeling very bad. I said, look, I can be as a researcher, we can say, oh, these are the issues happening at the ground level. Yeah, but we can suggest, but it's a shame. I personally feel that we can't do anything for them. And if you look, I think might be the same thing. When you are talking to those people, you can see some light of hope in their eyes, that there is somebody listening out to our problems, and so is going to do something for us. So what I would say, it's easy to approach the smaller marginal, but it is difficult to approach banks unless you have contracts.
Yeah, that certainly reflects my experience in the field as well.
Yeah.
I also found that some banks, like the State Bank of India, have their own skill development programs,
yeah.
and the participation in those programs might get easier access to loans, but other skill development programs, there are a lot of problems with actually having the qualifications recognized. And the main thing they're concerned about, as Navjot was saying in her talk, was collateral. And if you've got land, that's easy. But if you're trying to do something like beekeeping or mushroom growing, where it's something you can do without much land, it's very hard to have that recognized as an asset.
Mm. So it's more the state banks who provide the credits and loans, or?
Well, I would think so, but perhaps Navjot would know better about that than I.
Yeah. So yes, private banks, they don't entertain. According to them, agriculture is very risky. They just entertain the bigger farmers. Yeah. There are corporate societies and cooperative banks as well, but the farmers need to be members of those societies, and the eligibility criteria for being a member is that one should have land at least 2 acres or 1 acre of land, nothing less than that. And there are farmers which go less than that. So that they are excluded from that sector, and they go to these informal lenders. I've done a paper on it's a book chapter, the book chapter on informal lending, and you will see how they get exploited by the. Okay, so state bank, yes, state bank again is no easy. So there are so many things I won't be able to tell.
Yeah. And when access to finance is such an important thing for actually being able to do something with your skills, it's really quite important. I might just bring Simon up to the stage in case he has any questions, because he isn't able to communicate using the other channels, I think.
Thanks, Trent. Yes, I was trying to work out if there were any buttons that allowed me to do anything from behind the scenes. Yeah, I've been really interested thinking across the two panels and linking back to that previous issue, about in a sense, the joined upness of this. So I think a lot of the stories we've heard today seem to be about skills interventions that actually require an enabling environment in other spaces, but that the rest of the environment isn't joined up, whether that be the banks or other bits of the state system, etc. So I didn't know if anyone would like to comment on that. So is there a problem that skills initiatives stand alone rather than are linked to wider systems changes?
Should I answer that?
Yeah, if you'd like to, Sidney, if anyone would like to comment on it. But yeah, why don't you start?
Yes, I think they shouldn't stand alone. They should be linking to the wider systems. For instance, like the model I presented in a social skills ecosystem, that is where you have various players coming together to develop skills. For instance, like in the case of Sebastian, where he was presenting some of the stakeholder, but I did not see how they relate, the relationship in helping rural farmers. So you should be having banks, for instance, doing financial lending. Then you have got universities through research trying to develop skills for smallholder farmers. Then you also have the local economic development agents, like in the case of Alice, trying to support providing a framework from the side of government. how this relationship should work. So it doesn't have to be a standalone. It has to work within a system.
Great, thanks, Sidney. Any thoughts from the others?
I hope I understood the question correctly. Coming to the case of Meghalaya, I had the experience that the state of Meghalaya has voluntarily went his own way because they weren't satisfied with what the central government in Delhi, far away, was doing, and it was not tailored to their needs in the little rural state of Meghalaya. So that's why they wanted to do their own thing and didn't want to be part of a bigger picture. And that's why they are trying to implement their own idea of vocational education and training.
But are they bringing together all the actors that need to be there? Or is it the state doing it and not thinking about all the others who need to also do it with them?
They also tried to bring the chambers of commerce into the picture. So I felt that they are aware that they're not only can go state tells what to do and the people have to do it, but they also try to bring, and that's why they accepted our approach with the demand-drivenness. They realized that it's important to bring the people and the companies all together, and research university as well.
Great, thank you. Naujat, is there anything you want to add, or should I hand back to Trent?
Yes, I agree with the answer. And again, the thing is, everyone is working as a group. I think governments, or the university, for example, in Punjab, again, I'm referring to Punjab, there is Punjab Agriculture University. So when I look into all this, because they are into that field, and I want more involvement from them. I personally think that they can go to they can send their students to the farmers, and then and they can bring all the actors on one platform rather than everyone working in their own solos. Yeah. So at the moment, there are various projects going on in various states or the central government. Because what Sebastian presented today, a very interesting presentation, but I wasn't aware about that. I researched for Punjab. So can you say, so much is happening in different states, and if the central bodies, they can put all these things together, I think then there can be lessons learned from other states, there can be improvements, and there can be more employment, and trust can be built among people to exercise and to do various things. So that's what I personally think.
Great, thank you very much. Can I pass back to you then, Trent?
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, I think it really identified what seems to be one of the common themes that runs through all of the talks today, and it strikes me as being something that really resonates with the theme of the panel, that perhaps skill development could potentially be a site for leadership, in the sense that in order for skills development policy to have the impacts that it needs to, it actually needs to overcome a bunch of other problems. And it could be a site for discussing a whole range of issues that sort of restrict rural development. I mean, I was thinking during Sebastian's presentation about marketing. You mentioned that there was a demand for marketing skills, but I wonder if just doing skills training in marketing on its own could really overcome these problems without other reforms to the the dominance of middlemen and all of these kinds of issues.
Yeah, that's not going to work. That's not going to work out. It's just this little part, bringing the knowledge to the people, and even that they realize that there's a problem, that the middleman is getting all the profit, is one thing in the bigger picture. But exactly as you are saying, that's not what solves all the problems, giving them knowledge about marketing.
Right, right. So perhaps Sidney, what you were talking about with these, if I remember right, 45-degree activities. I suppose that speaks to this theme, right? This was sort of actors that work between these different players to try to bring things together. If I've understood you correctly.
Yes, that's correct. So these actors are working together, the supporting institutions, and so supporting institutions work together with, say, facilitating verticalities, and these are brought together by systemic leadership, which is the 45-degree activity, and these ones are brought together to work to harmonize this relationship in developing skills and trying to figure out what the needs are. And instead of competing to work individually, they work together in concert.
Yeah, well, but perhaps that's a good place to leave it on then, because it sounds like this is the kind of thing we need to be thinking more about, is what are these activities, and who are the actors who can actually bring these different players together to really make skill development have some kind of impact. So thanks everyone for coming along. It seems like we've only got the speakers left in the room anyway. But yeah, feel free to carry on the conversation afterwards. And I know we've had a lot of technical issues getting talks up, but hopefully we'll have the chance to share some of the materials that were presented, maybe some of the people whose recordings didn't come through quite so clearly, so that we can carry on the discussion and maybe see if there might be opportunities for us to publish together on this. So thanks everyone for some excellent presentations.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.